Good morning and welcome to Scotland Speaks at our usual time of 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning in a sunny Glasgow. And thank you very much indeed for your response to last week's show, which has been terrific, where we made an attempt at explaining the voting system in the Scottish parliamentary elections of next year and how important it is that we vote for independence across both ballot papers. Here's a look at what the excellent Robert Reid and Callum Ansell had to say. But a lot of people are thinking using number terminology, like vote this one, vote this number two. Given that Scotland also operates STV ballots, single transferable vote ballots in local authority elections, do you think it might be confusing if we use that terminology and some people might think you number it by way of preference?
Yeah, I think absolutely that's where the confusion arises. If you think back to the 2022 local elections, the SNP's message was SNP 1 and 2. Where Alba put forward vote for Alba 1, SNP 2. And so people, I think, are still in that kind of mindset. Last national Scottish election that we contested, that's how we should vote, and it's not in any way connected. It's almost like two first past the post ballots, but the proportionality doesn't come from ranking, it comes from when the votes are counted afterwards and then they get divided by a certain number of, how many number of seats a particular party wins. And so it's important not to go into the ballot box and vote for all the candidates on the list. That's not how it works. The only vote that would count in that instance would be your number one ballot. And so really we need to get our minds away from saying SNP 1, Alba 2 or vice versa, and getting in the mind of saying list vote Alba. It's about voting Alba on the list, and that's the key message that we need to get out to our voters and our activists.
Callum?
It's also important to bring up the impact that would have had on the SNP's number of MSPs, because they would have gone under those circumstances from having 64 MSPs just down to 62 for the benefit of an extra 30 nationalist MSPs in Parliament. And the payoff is enormous.
So let's just repeat that because it's so important. They would have gone from the SNP having 64 MSPs overall to just dropping the two if people, instead of voting SNP in the list, had voted for Alba, from 64 to 62. But that would also have meant, on the other side of the equation, 30 Alba MSPs, which would have delivered, again to quote Alex, because how can we not, to the 2021 election strategy, which was brainchild, was a super majority. And here's what you had to say in relation to this video.
Here's how the Scottish elections work in 2 minutes. Scotland is split up into 8 regions. Each region has around 9 local constituency MSPs that you vote for using your lilac-coloured ballot paper. This vote is simple. The candidate with the highest vote in each constituency wins the seat. Each region then has to elect another 7 MSPs on what's called the regional list. These 7 are elected using your peach-coloured ballot paper. Here you vote for one party. Each party's votes are counted up and then they are divided by the number of seats that party has already won, plus 1. For example, in 2021, the SNP won 9 constituency seats in the North East. The 148,000 votes they got on the regional list were divided by 10, giving them just under 15,000 votes. The other 133,000 votes were wasted. This meant the SNP did not win a single seat on the regional list in the North East of Scotland. Despite getting the most votes in every region, the SNP only won 2 of 56 regional list seats up for grabs, with unionist parties picking up 46 of them. If, however, SNP voters had decided to back Alba on the regional list instead, the 46 seats won by unionist parties would have been cut to 24. The SNP would have sacrificed just 2 single seats, and in return, the second largest party would have been the pro-independence Alba Party with 30 seats. It would have been an independence supermajority in the Scottish Parliament. In 2026, don't waste your vote. Vote Alba on the regional list.
Geronimo says, that is some good comms. Everyone in Scotland needs to see that. Vote Alba on the list. SN4 says, always enjoy these videos. Thank you very much indeed. Bill Hines says, the guys have done a great job with the graphics. They certainly have. And finally, Helen says, excellent explanation of how the voting system works and how Scots should consider their voting intentions in the upcoming Scottish elections. One point with regard to the very helpful wee slides, which showed the results of how Scots had voted against what the outcome would have been had the list votes been given to Alba. The slides indicated Tories with the Union Jack and Labour's with the Rose. I would posit that on that Labour Rose should also be included the Union Jack. Ditto the Lib Dems logo should include the Union Jack. This should be made clear on any and all slides to further assist voters in their voting choices. They are branch offices of English registered parties in Scotland. They're not even and never have been Scottish registered parties and should never be referred to as Scottish parties. We should all be aware for whom and what we are voting. Well said, Helen, and we will bear that in mind. Stay tuned, because coming up after the break, I'll be speaking with Nick Dury, the chair of the Alba Party Housing Group, and Laura Jones, who's been fighting for single-sex provision for homeless young women. We'll see you after the break. Welcome back to Scotland Speaks, where I'm delighted to be joined here in the studio by Chair of the Alba Party Housing Working Group, Nick Dury, and housing activist Laura Jones. Welcome both to Scotland Speaks. It's lovely to have you here. Now, we're going to be talking about housing and single-sex provision for women in particular, but before we come to that, let's talk about what's led us to this situation, and that is, of course, the Supreme Court ruling, which was some would term a clarification, but other of us who knew what the Equality Act stated was merely just a restatement of fact. What do you think the impact of that has been on some of the responses you've seen from various organisations in the past few weeks? Nick, I'll come to you first.
Well, I'm really glad that the Scottish Tenants Organisation and Laura is leading on the charge here, because I think many of unions and activist organisations seem to have doubled down on a false interpretation of the law, and that's extremely unhelpful. And it does show why there is this lacuna in policy, why this bad thing has been allowed to happen, because organisations which should by right be representing people have taken their eye off the ball through ideology, and I think it's telling, and it is marked and positive that the STO is doing something different from that.
And why do you think unions have taken this point of view, in the understanding that the law states something completely contrary?
Well, I think there is a professional dogma, and I think it is among a professional strata, and that applies to all sorts of organisations where they've got professional people, running things, where there's a sort of right think that develops, and people use the word colonise. Perhaps that's too harsh, but I think certainly my own experience. I worked for Living Rent at one stage and was effectively sacked for believing in biological reality and material reality, and that culture seems to pervade in a lot of workers' organisations, which I think is very sad, because if they polled their members on it, they would have to take different positions.
And that's very interesting. Of course, the Sandy Peggy case is ongoing, and more power to her in that. Do you think that's not even the start of, because it's been ongoing, but can we anticipate a number of cases of people suing their employers for wrongful dismissal and sacking?
Well, I should certainly hope so. And of course, it's telling, the Sandy Peggy case, because you had the likes of the STUC, Unison and Unite all making coded statements condemning Peggy, who of course is in the right. And that, that's the culture that needs to change if we are to get justice for ordinary people.
Mm-hmm. Laura, you've been a housing activist for forever, but in particular, I think the clarification, to use their terminology, those who opposed it, they've said it was a welcome clarification. I think that was Sir Keir Starmer's words, as opposed to interpretation of the law. As a lawyer, which you should be most able to interpret, that has had an impact on, I think, what you would feel would be an added strength you're allowed to add to what you've been advocating for. And you've now brought a petition in that respect. Please tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I think the Supreme Court ruling has been huge for us because it's part of the reason that women have paid so much attention to the petition. I don't think it's the only reason. I think part of it is that we've got a lot of very angry feminists who feel like their voices aren't being listened to, and that women's concerns in general in society aren't being listened to by the political class anymore. And part of that is to do with this whole NGO and the unions being captured in the way that Nick is talking about. There is also a really strong sense of feeling about the housing crisis, I think, now. We're seeing that, and it's a much bigger political issue than it was a couple of years ago. But yes, certainly the fact that these women have been coming together for about a decade now, trying to get clarification on this law, to get preservation of single-sex spaces, has been a huge form of support for us. So the petition, actually initially we did a change.org petition to try to raise awareness of the situation, and then we realised, well, let's just put the petition to Scottish Parliament. The petition to Scottish Parliament was accepted and it had about 600 signatures on it. The change.org petition, I sort of left it and then I came back to it a couple of weeks later and it had 36,000 signatures on it. And that was a surprise to me, and I think a lot of the big feminist organisations shared it around and gave it a lot of support, which has been a huge help to us. But it shows, I think, that there's a huge amount of people who feel very strongly about this, because we are talking about the most vulnerable people in society.
Which is homeless women. Tell me what the name of the petition is so people can access it.
Yep, so it's just Women Out of Homeless Hotels currently. And it also refers to children. We're talking about, we need a statutory obligation to provide, at the point that women register with their council or their local authority as homeless, that there should be a statutory obligation to house them, and to house them in single-sex safe accommodation. But we've also got rising numbers of children staying in these homeless hotels. So at the moment, I think it's about 71 families with children in Glasgow. That's not across Scotland. And these places are just no place for a kid to be staying. We've already had reports of people saying that their children's personalities have completely changed after several months staying in these places. People don't feel safe. People have felt the need to go back and stay with abusive partners rather than stay in these places where they don't know what's going to happen and who's coming into their rooms. So children should absolutely not be staying in these places, and they never used to, really, until a few years ago. So
what is the current provision, Laura? Obviously you're petitioning for change and petitioning for implementation of the law as it stands. What is the current situation? What are the stories that you're hearing?
Well, I mean, the current situation legally is actually that the councils have an obligation, a legal obligation, to provide people with emergency temporary accommodation at the point that they apply as homeless, if they are deemed to be unintentionally homeless, which is usually the case. The problem is that obviously if you have a statutory obligation to provide housing, that means safe housing. That means housing that you're not getting attacked, obviously. So there's no obligation currently for it to be single sex. But what we're saying is that actually if you take these women's rights into consideration, the actual needs that they have and the real result of actually depriving them of single sex accommodation, you are actually putting people in danger of attack, sexual attacks, and potentially death, because the death rate among women in these places is almost 3 times as high as among men, which I think is because women self-exclude from these services to such an extent, because they hear the stories of women being raped, attacked and solicited for sex. There's also a lot of guys hang around outside these places trying to pick off vulnerable women and exploit them. So women self-exclude from these services. So that's why we're seeing so few women actually registering as homeless and actually staying in the accommodation. So once it actually gets out there that we have safe accommodation, this is a much, much bigger issue than we think. There are many, many women that are staying in dangerous or dodgy situations because they know that there isn't a safe place for them.
And Martin Williams, Herald journalist, recently highlighted the work that you're doing in that respect, which is very helpful, of course, to the cause. What other activism do you have planned, along with obviously the ongoing petition, because you are fundamentally an activist in terms of raising awareness on the issue?
We're very excited actually. The Scottish Tenants Organisation met with a committee, people from the Welcome Centre in Belfast last week. So they've just opened another single-sex emergency accommodation for homeless women in Belfast. So they had one that's been there for about 15 years. So much experience on the different kinds of needs that these women have, and also they now have 2 different spaces so that it's depending on where you're at in terms of your housing journey. Are you ready to go on to permanent accommodation, or do you need access to recovery services, to counselling, to other forms of help? So they are really on the ball in terms of providing wraparound care with like signposted to other services and a centre where everything is provided for these women to try to really ensure that they don't end up back in the system like so many do. And so they came over and spoke to us, and next week we're actually going to go to Belfast and visit their centres. And I'm really excited about that because I'm putting together, well, the STO is putting together a report that we're hoping to rival reports of the kind that Engender and Spice have brought out about this issue, but to present it in the situation, in the terms that we see it, and to present the solution, and to use the Welcome Centre in Northern Ireland as a model for the kind of services that we could provide in Scotland.
Well, we very much look forward to hearing about that on your return, and I hope you'll come and tell us about that, because obviously we'd like to know about what's happening in Belfast. Nick, is this just a Glasgow problem, or is it across Scotland?
I think it's definitely across Scotland. You know, every time you look at the statistics for the number of children or people who are homeless, they keep rising. And I think that there's all sorts of reasons for that, but you know, people's lives are not improving at the moment. They're getting worse. The economy's hammering people, and the big mo, to use that American phrase, is women and families. And historically, homelessness was more men, older men. So the fact that that's changing means that, you know, the bank of mum and dad is no more. People are being kicked off sofas and being put into real destitution, which you know, it's a sad fact, but that's where we are.
And very recently, Nick, you were campaigning outside the Homeless Project Scotland night shelter to keep that open. And that is a shelter, Laura, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that actually has a single sex provision. There's quite clearly a sign, and there's a special room, safe room.
So they're very unique in that respect, in that they have a female-only room. The space in general isn't single sex because it is a mixed open space in the middle. But the room is female only, and they have staff at hand 24/7, well, all night long, and they do every 15 minutes they do a safety check on the room. So there's nothing like it in terms of provision for actually caring for those people. And when I asked Colin McInnes about it, I said, could I possibly take a wee picture of that? He hadn't realised that was even special. He said, well, we just assumed that you would have a separate room for women. He hadn't realised that was even an issue. It
was your picture I saw, actually, Laura, on social media that alerted me to the fact, although I'd visited the shelter, I automatically assumed there'd be a women's space, but it's when you actually see the sign that you think we have to start asserting our rights that we always thought that we had and we fought so hard for. Nick, the bigger situation regarding Homeless Project Scotland, you are part of a campaign, as we all are. The Alba Party is hugely supportive to keep that provision going. Where are we in all of this? Well,
I know that the council is no friend of the project and has been attempting to evict them. And I know that they're fighting back. Obviously, we'll give as much support as we can, but that speaks to a lack of vision there and in the city chambers. Almost a kind of, this is nice, we'll get rid of it. And that's the attitude that's led us to the crisis we're in.
Mm-hmm. And we will be speaking more about the housing crisis after the break. Join us then.
Water is life, but not all water is equal. Our water ionizer restructures and alkalizes water for optimum hydration and detoxification, recreating the planet's ultimate water sources, found in lightning-struck lakes and newly melted icebergs. H2 Pure Source. Change your water. Change your life.
Welcome back to Scotland Speaks, where I'm delighted to be joined by Nick Dury and Laura Jones, and we're talking all things housing, or lack of, Nick, in Scotland. And when ALBA launched in 2021, Alex Neil, former MSP and Cabinet Secretary, great mind, helped us out by drafting a housing document for us, detailing what Scotland needs to do to house its population. You now chair the ALBA Party Housing Working Group. Tell us a bit about your work and plans for the future, and how much of what Alex said has impacted on future work.
Well, there's a big crisis. Everyone's accepted that. You know, the government itself has said there's a housing emergency, and so tackling that it takes in many different forms. But starting with Alex Neil's paper in 2021, at the time he was calling for 100,000 public homes, and that has subsequently been found to be a shortfall. Recently he's changed his tune to saying 200,000 public homes, and that's certainly what the working group was discussing. But obviously, how do we get there? We will need the powers of independence to build that many homes. But in the meantime, there's work to be done. He recently published another paper, how do we address the housing emergency, and the STO in fact hosted a meeting with him, and I was pleased to attend, where he said that you could leverage around £20 billion of pension capital with, it must be said, less interest rates than on the borrowing than from the Debt Management Office. So effectively cheaper borrowing for local authorities, in which we could double the amount of public homes that we're currently constructing, and using the likes of the Newtown Development Corporation model, sell homes through a national house building company, and use that to fund even greater amounts of social housing. And we could do that here and now. We don't need independence for that. It's just a question of political will. And I think we need to inject that into the body politic. We need action now, not a big boy did it and run away.
Now, was this a presentation at the STO, the Scottish Tenants Organisation, by Alex Neil?
Yes.
And how you're both involved in the STO. First of all, tell me tell us, tell the viewers a bit about that organisation, and then I'm interested to find out what the response was to Alex Neil's suggestions. Laura, a bit about the STO.
Well, Scottish Tenants Organisation actually came out of the rent strikes in the organisation back in the 1916, was it? The Glasgow rent strikes. And they've been active in one form or another for, more than 100 years. More recently, they were fighting the stock transfer back in the late 90s, which saw us lose a lot of our council housing. And since then, we've moved to this model where it's social housing controlled by housing associations, which are being bought up more and more by the Wheatley Group, which is obviously beholden to its shareholders and not to the people that it serves. So the SDO is all about, we need council housing, a return to the council housing model, and we need a mass building programme of council housing, which is then going to be accountable to the people it serves and not just there to make money for private companies.
And how was Alex's suggestion received?
I think very positively. I mean, I've been involved in many campaigns, and you always have to ask yourself, if it's something that will cause someone in power a headache, where does the money come from? And he answered it. And I think that's really key, because I've been puzzling about how do we manage to build the transformational increase in public housing that we need? And there is an answer now. So if you can build it for cheaper than directly from UK government gilt-edged treasuries, effectively cheaper than that, then why aren't we doing that? That's a real political lacuna.
And I'm anticipating that part of Alex's uplifted doubling of the provision he says we now need, and his suggestions as to how we get there will form part, or is forming part, of the Alba Housing working groups.
Yes, absolutely. It takes in so many things though, because we really are in a massive crisis, and it affects every part of the country. So we need action. And
can we touch on, Glasgow takes in a lot of refugees, and this is a sensitive issue because people make Glasgow, refugees are welcome here. There is a housing issue that's necessarily connected to that because of the numbers of people that are coming specifically and only to Glasgow. Can you just talk us through a bit of that?
Of the 32 local authorities, only Glasgow is an asylum dispersal centre. So that's a UK government programme. But that means that nowhere else in Scotland are asylum seekers being housed. And obviously, if you serve out the asylum process and you're deemed to be a refugee and you've lived in Glasgow, then you are instantly made homeless. So what do? You avail yourself of your right to a house and you get emergency temporary accommodation, and rightly so, But because there's just a concentration of asylum seekers in Glasgow, that means that now 54% of emergency accommodation is taken up by refugees. And then, of course, there's two self-owns that the Scottish Government has done. The first is we remove priority need, and then we remove local connection. So that means that, for example, if you were an asylum seeker in Birmingham and you become a refugee and you're made homeless, you can get on the megabus and come to Glasgow and present as homeless. So that's placing a huge burden on homeless services in Glasgow in particular. And what that means is, with the point system, and there's a lot to discuss about the point system, but more on that later, you are instantly top of the housing list. So that's changing communities very rapidly. And it's because of this concentration in Glasgow, because it's the only asylum dispersal centre in Scotland, and also because of the way in which we abolished local connection and priority need.
So basically, in a nutshell, Nick, what we're saying here is the management of this issue by Westminster, because we lack the powers of independence to work all of this into something that is a good and welcome scenario for refugees and people looking for housing in Scotland. What we now have is what appears to be, and in reality is, people seeing that there are others coming as they return them, taking their houses, which is creating an unnecessary hostility when it is possible, by proper management of the issue, to house everybody as they should be housed, as is a legal right.
Yes, precisely. I think there's also the law of unintended consequences here, because I'm sure the government meant well when it abolished local connection and priority need, but they weren't looking years ahead to see what would happen when only one council was a UK government asylum dispersal centre.
And politically, do you think this has got something to do with why Reform are finding finding support for themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, when I canvass housing schemes, what I find is people feel a loss of control, and that happens alongside what we've seen with the cost of greed crisis, what we've seen with people's living standards falling. So they feel this sense that a community that once they would have had a lot more agency over, they have none, and it's changing rapidly. And very often people are on waiting lists for rehousing because they're overcrowded or in a damp and mouldy home, and they find that new build housing are going to people who don't have a connection to the community. So this sense of family and connection is being lost alongside a process that they can't really understand. And that is, unfortunately, that is fuel for the kind of right-wing hatred we've seen.
So people may be deeming in this situation that a vote for reform is a protest vote, but it's effectively a vote for a party which will sit at Westminster, which will then not change anything.
Yeah.
And in actual fact, the real protest vote, we would argue, is a vote for the Alba Party, which is a vote for nationalists, for control over our own assets and responsibility, so we can make all of these things better for everybody, which of course, as I must now turn to, as we touch on in every programme as much as we possibly can, Alex Salmond, who has driven us up to the point of when he was no more, but he lives on in all of us and in what we want to do in the future, particularly achieving independence and completing his dream. He attended at Wynford Estate more than once, which he tried to save, and engaged with people there. How important was that, Laura? We were interviewing people in grassy areas, any grassy area we could find, locals there, and he sat for hours and spoke to them. Tell us a bit about the impact of Alex on that estate.
That was huge for us in terms of the publicity that it gave us, but also in terms of the support that we got from the community after that. Like, that was a huge meeting, and that was such a good feeling to have him come. He dealt with it so well. He said the things that the people had been desperate to hear for so long, specifically about getting rid of Wheatley's monopoly on social housing in Scotland. The room went absolutely wild when he spoke about that. And I think it is important to remember when we're talking about the refugee and the homeless crisis that there were 600 flats sat there empty in the Wynford for almost 4 years while we said, listen, why don't you use these flats? So you've got people protesting outside of hotels where these poor people are being kept. It's an absolute disaster. It's creating all this social tension. We've got perfectly decent homes right here. You could create a hub. You could have a mixture of different kinds of tenures. You could create a hub where people could share food, clothes, and all the rest of it. We were completely stonewalled by the government, Green Party, SNP, and these people now continue to stand and say that they welcome refugees. Well, where were they when we provided a solution?
And of course, this made no sense at all to you and of course to Alex, because it was a public meeting, first of all, where we heard about people's views. Then we came to film and interview people so we could highlight what was happening. And then we went back for a screening for another public meeting for people to watch what we had recorded. Such was Alex's commitment. Nick, can you tell me a bit about your experience with Mr. Salmond?
Well, I think what I found most interesting was his suggestion of having a poll, having a referendum for the people to decide whether they support effectively the manager's vision of our estate or the people themselves determining their own destiny. And I remember we talked about independence for Mary Hill. So we took that suggestion on and we exercised it, and we did in fact have a legally enforced ballot, which we won by a supermajority, demonstrating that the authority's vision of demolishing half a housing estate to replace it with more expensive homes was not one that was shared by the wider community.
I was really pleased at that, being an advocate of supermajority to achieve important ends.
It had the desired effect, because from that point the authorities walked back from essentially gentrification to not a vision that I would support, but a better vision where there's more social housing in the mix and a retention of the community centre. So more to be done, water under the bridge, and these things always take many years and you have to keep on them all the time, but certainly a big step forward.
And a perfect example of the strategic genius, and that was Alex Salmond, because he found a manner in which you could perhaps make them pay more attention than they were. And that was using the ballot box, as we intend to do in his honour and in honour of the cause in 2026 election. Now, before we leave, Alex campaigned for you. Nick, you were a candidate in the 2024 election outside that big Tesco's in Maryhill. How much fun was he on the campaign trail?
Well, we certainly had a big turnout that day, and obviously a lot of horns being honked and engagement. So it was a fine day to have an impromptu flash mob outside our town centre. So many more in the future, I hope.
Absolutely. Laura, any last reflections from you on time you spent with Alex?
Oh, do you know what? I mean, it's maybe not relevant politically, but I was actually really surprised how kind he was. Because I have a tendency to get nervous and start babbling, and he was extremely kind and friendly, and just, yeah, treated you like he wanted to be there and know what you were saying.
That's lovely. A lovely way to end the show. It's amazing how many people say on the cesspit, one could say that is X, be kind, hashtag, and then proceed to be anything but kind. But let us take your words, Laura, and the demonstration of Alex's kindness to you as a means to move forward. Thank you both, Laura and Nick, for joining me on Scotland Speaks. We hope to hear more from you, and particularly the important work you're doing on housing the people of Scotland, as is their legal right. That's all for us here at Scotland Speaks. We look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place. Until then, take care.